today. Thanks for the opportunity to be with you. I wanted to cover basically two aspects of the continuing problem with the status of the MEK here in the United States and the problems of Camp Liberty and Camp Ashraf. They're disparate, but I think actually closely related, because it all goes to the way in which the United States is not properly handling the threat posed by the regime in Tehran, in the region and around the world, or the treatment of the refugees at Ashraf and Liberty. And let me start with the immediate humanitarian concern Patrick talked about so movingly. Not only has the United States failed here to live up to the representations that were made to the residents of Camp Ashraf after the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, but the United Nations is failing as well. I want to focus on that failure. Others, I think, will talk about the failure of the United States to live up to the commitments that it's previously made. And this failure by the United Nations is obviously having its most direct, most immediate impact on the residents of Ashraf and Liberty, but it's also damaging the United States, the United Nations as a whole. And I think the failure, although we tend to focus on Ambassador Martin Kobler, the real failure is the failure by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees in many respects. The first is that just inexplicably to me, UNHCR appears to be taking its orders from Ambassador Kobler. This is fundamentally inconsistent with the whole rationale for creating an independent agency devoted to refugees. The people who created the High Commissioner's Office decades ago understood that refugee problems have inherently political ramifications. But what they wanted to do was to create an international organization whose mission was the protection and assistance of the refugees themselves, divorced from whatever political context the refugee situation arose in. And it was for the High Commissioner political consideration. What that meant was that the High Commissioner had to be independent of the political pulls and tugs within the UN system, independent of the Security Council, independent of the UN General Assembly, but most importantly, independent of the governments that were involved. And it was the obligation, particularly of the United States and the other countries that were behind the creation of the High Commissioner's Office, to protect that independence. Because if the High Commissioner for Refugees can't give protection and assistance to refugees, nobody else can. And what we see here in this entire transfer process from Ashraf to Liberty is the subordination of UNHCR to the UN mission in Iraq. And that is a fundamental violation of the principles for which UNHCR was established. Everybody understood that refugee situations were difficult for all of the participants. But by allowing the High Commissioner to act simply as an agent for Ambassador Kobler, we have eviscerated the whole rationale for the UN's participation in the protection mission. I think what we need to see here is not simply getting the United States to do the right thing and delist the MEK and take affirmative steps to begin the relocation process out of Iraq, which is the only solution that's going to be fair and equitable to the residents of Ashraf and Liberty and their families around the world. But we've got to insist that the High Commissioner himself stand up for his own mission. Stand up for his mission to protect and assist refugees. Now, you can argue about whether Ashraf is a refugee camp or Liberty is a temporary relocation facility. You can argue about the jargon, and you can argue about a lot of the technicalities, but there isn't any ambiguity here what we're dealing with. This is a refugee situation. The United States, in its first interviews with the residents of Ashraf after the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, made that clear, and a very thorough job that they did before designating the residents of Ashraf as protected persons under the Geneva Convention. This is the first step and a big one toward legitimate refugee status. UNHCR has got to do more to fulfill its functions. And the argument that somehow or another they have to be subordinate to Ambassador Kobler is just totally wrong. UNHCR was intended to be creative and flexible. I remember after the first Persian Gulf War, when the Kurds fled out of the cities in northern Iraq toward the Turkish border, but largely remained inside Iraq, and we had a desperate humanitarian situation, we asked UNHCR to step in to provide protection and assistance for the Kurdish refugees. And Madam Ogata, who was then the High Commissioner, called me up and said, look, this is not technically our mission. These people are not refugees. They've not crossed an international border. We're prepared to do it, but we want to know where the United States stands on it. And I said what was obvious from what President Bush and Secretary Baker said: we will support anything UNHCR does to provide protection and assistance to those Kurds, whether they're on the Iraqi side of the border or the Turkish side of the border. And so UNHCR stepped in and was creative and effective in mitigating that situation. UNHCR could do this easily. And if it's a question of funding, the United States, even in our difficult budget situation today, can help out. And so should our European friends. This is a solvable problem. And the fact that it's not being solved is attributable to the UN and to the U.S. State Department. So that means that as U.S. citizens, our job is to do what we can here in Washington to get that fixed, and also to lobby the United Nations in New York, the Secretary General, and the High Commissioner for Refugees in Geneva. This failure to take effective action, unfortunately, is also a counterpart to our collective failure to deal with the ongoing nuclear weapons program that the regime in Tehran has been pursuing so successfully. And that, combined with the regime's role as the world's central banker of international terrorism, are the principal reasons why the rest of the world needs to be concerned about the policies that the regime is pursuing, and why, in my view, and it's been my view for a long time now, the only real answer to the threat posed by the current government in Tehran is regime change. Government you can negotiate with. Their objectives are fundamentally contrary to the best interest of the United States and the best interest of the people of Iran. Look at what's going on now, what's just happened in the past few days in both Syria and in Bulgaria. In Syria, we have a dictatorial regime supported primarily by Iran, Russia, and China. Iran, the government in Tehran has Revolutionary Guards officers on the ground assisting the Syrian military. There's little doubt in my mind that among the other interests they're trying to preserve by keeping Assad in power are activities related to their illicit nuclear program. We know that Syria, ever since the Israelis bombed the North Korean reactor being built in Syria in September of 2007, Syria has refused to allow the International Atomic Energy Agency to come into the country to look at the site of the reactor, or to look at other sites that the IAEA has asked to see where they suspect that that nuclear activity is going on. This is something that endangers peace and security in the Middle East and the whole world, not just the nuclear, but Syria's chemical weapons program, its biological weapons program, and the nuclear work. A few hours ago, according to press reports, Russia and China again cast a double veto in the Security Council against a Western resolution to extend the UN observer mission under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which would be the beginning of giving that mission some teeth. I expect they will extend the observer mission, but there were Russia and China standing with the mullahs in Tehran against those trying to bring some peaceful resolution to the situation in Syria. So as long as Iran continues to support Assad, as long as it continues to support Hezbollah in Lebanon, we're going to have this problem continue. And that's why the terrorist attack in Bulgaria highlights even more, not just the continuing support for international terrorism by the mullahs, but the risk of what happens once they get nuclear weapons. This is a situation that's not going to be answered by negotiation. It's not going to be answered by the pressure of economic sanctions. Ahmadinejad said today that the sanctions will simply cause Iran to be even more defiant. And, you know, it's not entirely surprising when people have recommended an attack against the nuclear weapons program in Iran, one response always is, but that will simply cause the people of Iran to rally around the mullahs. I have never believed that, because I think the people of Iran are smarter than that. They understand this is an attack on the mullahs' threat to the rest of the world, not an attack on the people of Iran. So, you know, we can talk about half measures for a long time. The problem is we're in a race. We're in a race to see whether outside pressure prevails to bring the regime down or whether the regime gets nuclear weapons. And the odds are at this point, the most likely outcome is that the regime is going to get nuclear weapons. So if you don't like the way they treat the people of Iran now, if you don't like the pressure they put on the al-Maliki government in Iraq, if you don't like their support for the Assad regime in Syria, if you don't like their support for terrorists like Hezbollah and others around the world, how much worse will it be once they get nuclear weapons? That's what the issue is here, and why our government needs to be more effective. And the most single telling piece of evidence that we haven't gotten that picture is, despite the uncontradicted testimony of experts in terrorism across our government on a bipartisan basis, that the MEK doesn't belong on the list of foreign terrorist organizations, it remains there. If we were to take the MEK off, which I think is justified by all the facts, at least that I know, that would be a very powerful signal to the mullahs in Tehran that their days are numbered. Thank you very much.